their exhibition, This Is Not a Body. We have a membership level that is pay what you wish, so you can sign up with any amount. You can sign up to be a team member on our website, nomadicdivision.org, or with their team members at the table in the back, this over here. Thank you to all my members here tonight. We hope you will support programs like this by joining as a member, and join us tomorrow at noon for a special walkthrough. Panteha Abareshi is a Canadian-born American multidisciplinary artist and curator, primarily working within installation, video, and performance art. They are Jamaican and Iranian descent. Their work is rooted in experience as someone with sickle cell zero beta can I get help? Thalassemia, thank you. A genetic blood disorder that causes debilitating pain and bodily deterioration that both increases with age. Through their work, Abareshi aims to discuss and question the complexities of living within a body that is highly monitored, constantly examined, and made to feel like a specimen. Their practice explores questions of identity, race, and illness to create a visual language able to articulate their fears, insecurities, and confusions around their chronic illness and identity. Today's artist lecture, Abareshi will share their theoretical research and articulation that laid the foundations for the show, This Is Not a Body, on view at Shaw Fine Art. Beginning with the survey of the new work, the lecture will expand to encompass larger questions around fetishism and the role of sick, disabled bodies as fetish object, from popular media representations to the various forms of pornography and explicit fetish materials found online. This lecture will explore the notion of consent and the question of whether the disabled body, as we imagine and understand it, is truly capable of consenting while under the harsh and unrelenting able-bodied gaze. Abareshi is a 2021 alum of Land by Air residency program in partnership with Work Arts. Without ado, can I get a round of applause to welcome Panteha Abareshi?
Thank you, Hugo, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. I'm so touched and appreciate you guys just coming out. And yeah, so I'm gonna talk for a while, and I have some pictures to show you up on this big screen, but and I will have time for questions specifically at the end. I love questions, I really appreciate them, but also please feel free to raise your hand like while I'm talking. Like, don't worry about interrupting me. And if you feel like you can't project, Hugo will lend you a mic, otherwise you might shout at me. So please feel free to interrupt with questions or comments or anything like that. I really don't want it to feel like I'm like talking at you guys until you have a turn to like think and ask questions and stuff, so please interject. I love being interrupted. Otherwise I'll just talk and talk and talk, so. Yeah, so I'm here tonight because I have a show up with Hunter at the gallery. If you haven't gotten to see it yet, it closes on the 17th this weekend, so yes, as Hugo said, I'll be doing a walkthrough tomorrow where I can hear me talk some more about the pieces. But this body of work has been in the making for over a year now, and I guess even longer than that, but is really the beginning of a new exploration into the idea of fetishism and looking at sort of building the body, fabricating the body in new ways, because I do work with a lot of like performance in my work, and using my own body as a representational material. And I'll talk about this more in the work, but first really inadvertently, and then once I sort of realized it with a more directed intentionality, I wanted to see what it would be like to push myself to make work about my own illness, about my own disability, where I'm completely outside of the work, and in many ways the work is actually inaccessible to me as the artist looking in after it's finished. So yeah, so that was the sort of beginning of this idea, and the early sort of foundations of that line of thought also really ran in parallel with this new examination of the prosthesis and the orthothesis. And I guess the difference between those two things, since I'll be using those terms a lot for people who don't know, is a prosthetic is something that replaces a limb or a part of the body that is dysfunctional or no longer part of the body, and an orthesis is something that is affixed to the body to aid in mobility, but not to replace. So a back brace is an orthesis, prosthetic leg is a prosthesis. But thinking about the body in parts, thinking about how we are comfortable with fabricating the body in like, you know, normal sort of visualizations of disability and illness, or separate from that, even when we, like, where we are comfortable seeing the body in pieces in ways that don't necessarily have a didactic connection to disability and illness, and why those two things are often separated, like how levels of comfort are fabricated around those things. I was really just curious about all of that, a lot of that stemming from a lot of my own loss of mobility, and so also thinking about all these like things that are becoming affixed to my own body. And in the work, as I'll get to, I also started really thinking about fetishism, because I started working with these really precious, to me, really precious objects, really precious materials, medical materials, materials that I've, you know, hoarded from the hospital in a very like self-admittedly kleptomaniac sort of way, and then also materials that I've sourced and found and built, all sort of to evoke this sort of medicalized industrial aesthetic, but, you know, working with these prosthetics that then became part of the work, they had such a weight and such a gravity for me, just as a material, and I was really curious about fetishism within that. And I realized through working on this and reading a lot about fetishism and illness, and like the idea of like the precious object and the obsession with that I definitely like have a medical fetish, and I like I'm not like, I won't use the word reconcile, but I've like definitely been able to sort of explore the idea of fetishism and the nuances within that, coming from the perspective of existing within a body that feels as though it's the subject of externalized fetishism that I have no control over, and then sort of looking at the same materials or very synonymous materials to my experience and experiencing a very sort of fetishistic relationship to that. And so fetish rolls on the fetish, but I think that through this work and in a lot of the work that's going to be coming after this as well, examining sexuality and sexualization and the disabled body as sort of a receptacle for sexual fantasy becoming synonymous with fetish, that's been really, really fascinating for me. And the sort of ways in which inherent sexualization is inserted into the disabled experience, and the sort of like simplest way that I think about it as I'm building new work is that there's this sort of like innate human instinct to sexualize what we find most vulnerable, and there's so much vulnerability in the way that we examine the disabled body as something that like fundamentally like cannot whatever you put after that, take care of itself, cannot function, cannot walk, cannot move, cannot feed itself, you know, cannot bathe. So you think about inability, and there's so much stigma around vulnerability and inability, and there's also a lot of really interesting sort of like gender stuff inserted into dynamics of care, into inability, the feminization of inability, then inherent sexualization when something is feminized, when something is vulnerable. All of these things collapse onto themselves and exist in a really interesting concentration within the disabled body. And so I think that has been, I think that it'll be more present in my work moving forward, but I do want to mention that now, because I'll sort of keep coming back to it, looking at these pieces that I've made that are so anatomical and yet so uncanny, that I am thinking about the ways in which we look and the ways in which we look at something and we are, without even realizing it, imbuing it with all of our own insecurities, all of our own fetishes, all of our own desires, all of our own taboos. And so you can look at any other body as sort of a prism for that, because like I said, this thing about vulnerability and the innate human desire to sort of like make that thing a sexual object. I think that, you know, yes, you can look at that with all forms of otherness, but with disability specifically, in the way that we understand disability manifested physically, it's very fascinating for me, and it's obviously coming from a very personal place. So I guess I'll sort of get into the work. And these are in like order of how I was thinking about them and sort of making them, but not in the direct sort of chronology. But this piece is called, excuse me, a demolition site. And this was my first sort of exploration into this idea of working with the prosthesis. And as you'll see, as these pictures are sort of like flicking through the screen, this sort of leg as an essential form of the piece. And from a sort of very like practical material standpoint, I collected all of these prostheses, ones that from my own personal medical archive of things that have been used on me, ones that I found by messaging people on Craigslist, on Facebook Marketplace, by, you know, yeah, like really digging around in like people's archives. And for me, like the material is very fascinating, so I'll talk about that a little bit. Thesis making is still very much a craft everywhere, in the sense that you train specifically under someone who's like a master of the craft to become proficient enough to be able to then go on and make your own ortheses. It's, you know, not something that is a widely understood craft, and also we're still using sort of like orthoretic techniques that were developed in like the 1970s in large hospitals that were funding research into these kinds of things. And so you find these archives of historical objects that they seem like to me, but they're really hyper-personal objects, you know, that have been molded to someone's body. And I'm taking those things and I'm remolding them to my own body. So these are all made with a thermoplastic that you can actually melt and reshape using heat. That's how they're originally shaped your body. And a lot of these ortheses that I'm working with are actually children's ortheses, which are the most common to find discarded or unwanted because the child that was using them has grown to a point that they no longer fit, or their illness has deteriorated to a different point where they need a more intense orthesis. So it brings into question both size and also, again, this sort of like inane history within a fetish object. You know, what is it within a material that charges it to then be used within a piece is something that is the first time that I've sort of worked with this outside of like materials that are like literally been used on me in the hospital. But I think that in examining the sort of like fundamental practices around fetishizing the disabled body, these pieces were very important for me to use, and to also completely disassemble. I disassembled all these ortheses and sort of like put them back together piecemeal, like a puzzle piece almost, like how many new bodies can I make from these 5 different ortheses that I have? And that's what led to sort of, you know, the pieces that you see in the show now. So there's no piece that is wholly itself. There's no piece that is like left intact, or like has had its integrity left intact, I guess if you think about it that way. And they've all been reformed again to sort of fit to a new body, a different body. And I think that within archiving, within the practice of archiving experience and disability, this is a really interesting new form of archiving for me, because I've been working for a long time in video performance work where I'm this very central sort of focal body in piece, and creating that work, I've also inadvertently documented my own deterioration and the worsening of my condition and the loss of my ability. I look back at, you know, performances I did in 2018, and I'm doing things with my body that I literally have no ability to ever do again. And so that taught me a lot about thinking about the archive of ability and sort of capturing the ways in which the body changes, and using that in my work to sort of call into question stigmas that we have around lessening of ability, and you know, why we feel so sensitive around a body that is worsening and is like able to sort of admit that and sit with that. And I think that now looking at new forms of archiving and new forms of looking at deterioration and the body as something that is, you know, inherently a sort of deteriorating system. You know, it's like every body is a petri dish of its own making that's just sort of decaying at a different rate. But looking at these objects and crafting new sculptural forms and sort of archival vessels for this idea of experience and deterioration and loss to sort of bounce around in like a sounding chamber was very interesting in what I was thinking about and important in what I was thinking about in this work. And I'm not going to talk about it now as much, but after I've shown some more pieces, I will come back to the like white foot, this silicone foot that I have been working with as a motif in this new bodied work. Again, thinking about insertion of self, removal of self, representing the body, you know, looking at these forms and declaring it to be a body is a very sort of like exciting, interesting thing for me. At a base level, it's sort of like a cyborg futurist notion of, you know, anything can be a body. You can like stick two pieces of metal together and you can call that a body. And like we need to like radicalize the way we think about corporeality to this point where we can like look at a pile of scrap metal and be like, that's a body, sure. Like, yes, like moving towards that sort of ideal, but also acknowledging how in so much of how we interact with futurity, and especially cyborg futurity, and you know, like my favorite areas of theory and research, xenofeminism, cyborg futurity, cyborg feminism, like there's like a blank space where the disabled body should be in all of that theoretical work. You know, you were reading Helen Hester and you're like, okay, but like what about the cripples out there, you know, what about them? And like, you know, it's interesting because the most sort of like literally decrepit bodies are devoid of these futurist ideals of like what we could do to radicalize imaging the body in a way that like is more inclusive. And I think that in this work as well, looking at the idea of the body as a cyborg, you know, looking at this form that is really both evocative of like antiquated medical forms, but is also like a piece of a cyborg that is, you know, like aching to be recognized as something, you know, is aching for an ability that it'll never have. I think that it's important for me to look both directions and say like, yes, like I want to move towards this sort of like radicalized idea of anatomy and corporeality, but also being like grounded in the reality that, you know, even like the expectations of the cyborg and in terms of ability are othering for so many people. And it's like, even within radical notions of anatomy and autonomy, there is a really staunch ideal of like what that body should be capable of doing. And by no means is my work or what I'm doing in my practice intended to sort of like promote any sort of like one radicalized ideal in any direction. It's not like I sit here and I'm like, we should be moving towards an ideal of cyborg futurity in which disabled cyborg is what we're all striving to be. You know, it's like where we are like maiming ourselves, we are like pulling out our limbs that are perfectly, you know, able and replacing them with metal parts, you know, as a way of like radicalizing anatomy. Like, do I think that's like a sick concept? Yeah, like I think it's like amazing. But I think that it's more about acknowledging all these different intersecting modalities of thought around the body, and how like when you're caught in the middle of that nest, all of a sudden you also become sort of like refracting prism. I always like using that word, prism, for whatever gaze is cast upon the body from whatever direction. Even coming from directions that are grounded in sort of like xenofeminist, futurist ideals of corporeality, you still have to like acknowledge that like a disabled body is not able to sort of think about, you know, radical green practices around corporeality, or thinking about, you know, the like xenofeminist ideal of like the full decay with the the body that melts into nothing and like is, you know, is not adhering to any gender ideal and then like melts into the earth in this beautiful sort of like eco-feminist way. When you're like a body that's made of half metal and you think about like what's going to be left after you're cremated, it's like a pile of shit that's never gonna decompose. It's like stainless steel and this clay that's made to never disappear from the earth. So it's all of these really interesting and really beautiful sort of intersecting ideals around the body that are most fascinating to me. I decided I want to always come back to that when I bring up these aspects of theory that I just, I'm critical of, but I really also am really entrenched in. Yeah. So yeah, that's this piece. I guess I'll talk about the other stuff too. But it's on a cart, and there's a little TV, and it has the only sort of instance of my real body being represented. It's a performance that I did with these prostheses sort of strapped to my hands and legs. Very barely even legible or visible. And that was important to me. I think that we expect a level of legibility when we walk into an art viewing space. We sort of expect that what we're going to be looking at is going to present itself to us fully, and it's going to, give us the information that we're looking for and be very gratifying. And I love that. When I look at artwork, I want that. But as a maker and as creating these pieces and also representing my own body and using it in the work, I think that it's really valuable and really important to not give the viewer what they want, and also to call into question the viewer's expectations of the bodies that they're looking at in the work, and why you are expecting a certain performance, and not in a critical way, but just in the way that we are really trained in every aspect of how we speak and how we think and how we move through the world to expect a performance out of the bodies that we're interacting with. And I don't mean that on a sort of social level or anything like that, but I mean rather in the ways in which people offer up legibility to us and perform legibility, and how you are expected to make your existence and your otherness sort of very present for other people. And when you're dealing with work that is very explicitly about otherness and about experiences that can be alienating or hyper-specific, like living with sickle cell disease, thalassemia, something that most people have no idea how to relate to, I think that it can also be alienating to understand how to broach that experience. And so again, it's one of those things where I'm in both ways, where I do not want to deliver upon a platter to the viewer this ideal of disabled experience in a way that is easily digestible, because it's not for anyone, it's not for me. And I think that acknowledging an innate complication in what it even means to not be able-bodied is really important, because I also think that the stratification between disability and ability is something that needs to be broken down, where we're able to be most people are not adhering to the able-bodied standards. That we then most people are disabled. I don't know. Let's talk about that. That's very interesting. But more to say, it's going to be impossible for me to even grasp this experience. But that's not going to prevent me from engaging with it and navigating it and sort of universalizing it in a way, because I'm dealing with themes of alienation, themes of pain, themes of existing within a corporeal form that is frustrating and inconducive to how I want to move through the world. All of these things are very base human experiences. So it's both of those things. So that's why I'm on the tiny screen and you can barely tell what's going on. These are the pieces in real life. And then this piece is also very the most sort of ephemeral in terms of showcasing this Klepto Archive that I have of medical materials, but more about creating sculptural collage and thinking about again the framework around the body. So for those who are curious, there's surgical prep wipes that they use when they're accessing the chest in my court. There's used morphine syringes. There's a glass syringe that's more so the vintage glass medical syringe. There's eye stretchers that hold your eye open when you're in surgery. There's that black ruler is used in crime scene photography. So it's a collection of things I think that is it's difficult to get the impact of it when you're not looking at the piece as a whole, but the intention behind this piece is more to think about the pieces of disabled experience as they come together and how they can be unified, but also how they can be quite disparate, and represented in these objects. You know, we attach experience to objects in these really interesting ways, again, coming back to like object fetishism, but like the ways in which we know what objects are like sick objects, hospital objects, you know, like those are things that you use on like sick people, dying people, and like what it means to really like love those objects and sort of like, again, imbue this really precious nature into them, but then also to think about bringing the highly private nature of suffering and being sick and living in a body that is like needs help and is sort of not adhering to this like clean, closed circuit idea that we have of the body, a body that is like secreting, a body that is, you know, oozing, a body that has tubes coming out of it, like this, you know, breaking the body open is a very like horrific sort of body horror, Cronenbergian kind of thing. And when you like, you know, that's very relegated to the private, whether it's like a private hospital room or like your bedroom, wherever. It's not where other people have to see it and deal with it. And so, you know, a lot of my work is also about bringing the private into the public and sort of sharing those things as personal artifact, as personal history, but inviting people to really look at that. And, you know, whatever comes with looking, also sort of contending with that, you know, making a spectacle, and then dealing with that spectacle, I guess, is something I do a lot in my work. But yeah, we can move on to the next piece. So this piece is called Lively Corpse. And again, looking at the sort of like piecemeal fabrication with these ortheses, and a little more information about the sort of technical aspect of this. There's different types of braces for bodies. And they are typically categorized into CAFO braces, which is knee, ankle, foot ortheses, and HCAFO braces, which is hip, knee, ankle, foot ortheses. But basically it dictates like how high the orthesis goes on the body. And, you know, like I was saying about these techniques that were developed in around the 1970s, this sort of joint that is used was created, patented in like the late 60s, and has been like the standard for braces, even though it's just like basically a really simple way of putting together two pieces of metal. And like finding the pieces for these was like extremely difficult, and so I also started fabricating them myself and sort of learning, or not even learning, but just sort of like figuring out like what it means to like build a body from scratch in a sense, and sort of like you know, put together this like famed sort of really futile anatomy. And I think that combining that with these pre-existing ortheses that are, again, you know, very evocative of like a child body, like these specifically, I think in person, they're covered in butterflies with light blue, very clearly like were worn by a child. And I think that like bringing that into the work is very like, it was kind of like scratch an itch in my practice that I've been wanting to do for a long time. And like the origins of that really are in my own experience growing up as a child in the like children's hospital system, which is a very freaky place to be. It's like, you know, I have a blood disorder, so I grew up with like the cancer kids, you know, the hematology ward. And what I have, my condition is very similar biologically to leukemia. It's, you know, it starts in the bone marrow, and it's essentially the body being unable to produce like correct cells in the body that is just sort of like dealing with that. And again, like I think the children's hospital is for anyone who spends enough time in it, it's sort of like a horror show, because it's like you'll have, a kid getting like a blood transfusion, and if there's like a clown, there's like these like crazy murals on the wall, like Mickey Mouse on your ceiling looking down at you, so that when you're like in bed, immobile, you can like look up and see like Mickey Mouse looking at you. A lot of the rooms have like skies pasted on the ceiling, so it like looks like you're like laying in a field. All these really interesting, like well-placed illusions, so that like if you have a very specific line of vision, you can forget for an instant that you're like in the hematology wing at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. You can like imagine that you're like at Disneyland or something. So much better, I guess. Anyways, a very interesting sort of landscape to look at how illness is imaged. Like for me, being there, it was very like conflicting, and I spent a lot of time there after I was no longer a child, because my doctor was there, and my illness is very specialized, and so it was difficult to think about leaving the hospital where I'd established care. And so I was like, an adult moving through a space that is designed for children. And I think that when we think about dying and we think about illness that is lifelong and deteriorative and will certainly end in some kind of death that is not natural old age, whatever blissful death that we have idealized, I guess. It's difficult to think about like sick kids for a lot of people, and so I got a lot of funky comments about being a sick kid. I'm not gonna like quote them back to you. I'll say like your imagination run wild, I guess. But people say like the strangest things to you, and a lot of that is revolving around the fact that you like don't deserve what you're going through, or that like there's a reason that you're going through it that you just haven't figured out yet, I guess. And I think that in looking at the ways in which we fundamentally relate to illness, and we sort of like fundamentally through that relate to our own death and the death that we see around us. Like the Children's Hospital was always a really concentrated space for me to think about that, and think about like the idea that a child is going to die, why people struggle with that so much, beyond the fact that people like kids. I think like digging deeper within that and thinking about what we identify as symbols within our culture, what we latch onto as symbols, and what we imbue into those symbols, and when those symbols are desecrated in front of us or defiled in front of us, whenever you want to think of like the image of a sick child, like what comes to mind for me very immediately, aside from what I actually experienced as a sick child, is all the rhetoric that exists around the need to cure, and sort of like, like St. Jude ads, and like, why is Sofia Vergara like telling me to donate to St. Jude? These were like strange appeals to like cure the children, help the children. And it's difficult living with a condition that has no cure, is like, just sort of like a grit and bear it sort of situation, and how uncomfortable that makes people, adult people. And I think that transitioning from children's care into the adult hospital care system, aside from the actual logistical nightmare that was, it also really represented for me the transition from, where interests are aligned in terms of the idea of preservation of life, value of life, because you go into any hospital in Los Angeles and you will fundamentally understand every problem that exists within our healthcare system in some way, even if it's one of the nicest hospitals. I think that when I was I don't want to talk about this for too long because I'll just start telling stories that are ridiculous, but when I was being treated at Children's Hospital LA, almost every day that I was in the hospital, a cast from some TV show would come through with their press team to take pictures with the sick kids. I have earphones that an NCIS LA cast member gave me. Why is that even something that happens? Why? And there's such a sick kid industry is so major. It's really so many people have tapped in on the branding of that. CHLA is like worse than like the Mall of America. It's like the HBO food lounge, and on the second floor, the AT&T chronic illness therapy lounge, and like the Costco parents lounge. It's ridiculous. Everything is literally branded like that. And I think that, you know, like wellness culture, I'm not even talking about like LA green juice wellness culture, but like literal like healing and wellness within a medicalized context really relies on the idea that like you can like hope and pray for many people that a solution will be found, because there's so much money and so much time and so much care being put into this, and like children and children's hospitals really represent that. And then you like go to an adult hospital and you're like, you suddenly realize that no one wants to look at sick adults that are dying, especially sick adults that are dying and have been dying for a very long time, and they're gonna keep dying until they're dead. Like that is one of the most difficult things we have to reconcile. And I think my work has like, in many ways, always been about that, because for a long time I didn't understand why I was struggling with it so much as someone who wasn't as sick as I am now, and I had to sort of like move through that. And then I started really struggling with why people around me were not able to understand that, and then also why like the language that we have fundamentally around illness is so frustrating and othering. And like the simple answer is because we're all scared to die. We're all really scared to die. And I think I spend a lot of time in this cycle within my work where it's like separating myself from this fear of death, and or sort of like try to pull myself so far out of it that I can like critically make work about being scared about dying, and then I'm sort of like snapped back into that reality because I'm making work, but I'm also living with a real illness, and so I'll like end up in the hospital, or my illness will progress to the point that I have to deal with. And this is the sort of interesting experience of the disabled artist, I think, is balancing this interesting dynamic between making work that is based very much so in a real lived experience, while also continuing to live that experience that is intensifying. I think that it's been really amazing and cathartic to make this work that I'm not in sort of like physical way, because oftentimes I'll make a video piece, and I'll shoot the video performance, whatever. I shoot at 8mm. It takes a really long time to develop the film, whatever. And then 6 months later, I'll be in the editing process, and I'll like, have no access to that performance because my health is worsened to a point now that is an alien sort of experience to me, or it looks like I'm watching a body that is unfamiliar to me. And I think that through that experience, coming back to what I was talking about before about dying, I think that it's really pushed me to evaluate, what we grasp onto in sort of the most frantic, fervent ways as humans. And I think that this concept that like everyone else is dying, but maybe you're dying a little bit differently, is something that at a very base level, a lot of people sort of feel and don't necessarily know how to like articulate, or would never articulate, because it's like a kind of ridiculous thing to say out loud. But this feeling that like maybe death will be different for you, death will not be so fundamentally bodily for you, death will not be so such a like disgusting expulsion of everything that is inside of you. All of these things. I think that like a lot of times we want to, it's so safe and so comforting to cling on to anything that gives us any inclination of that. Every sort of marketing scheme that exists out there around anything related to the body has like 100% tapped into this idea. So it's like, even if you don't realize that you're being sold the concept of a better death, you're being sold the concept of a better body that's going to have a more graceful death, or a better body that's going to live long enough to not have a violent death where you expel all of your bodily fluids, and it's stinky and it's so human in the sort of dirtiest kind of way. And so I think that like understanding my own fears and anxieties as I make work, or sort of like what is the most devastating to me as I make work about the body. Helped me really understand that, and that there is this sort of like very sweet, in many ways, desire, sort of very like base desire to just escape what humans have like feared for the longest time, you know, since humans existed. We've probably been scared of dying. So I think that it's a very sort of like simple foundation to everything, and I pile a bunch of other stuff on top of that, but I think that it always comes back to death for me. And my work is very clean. I'm working with these like very sterile materials. You know, I'm making work about the decrepit body, but it's, you know, the most sanitized space. It's the most sanitized materials, and I think that that's also really sort of like an interesting, important, interesting. I gotta stop saying that. Dynamic that I have with my own work, where it's this sort of like, again, like refusal to show something that is bodily enough to break out of this sort of pristine layer. You know, I think that the work is about evoking the body but not allowing the body to fully exist. The work is about, you know, suggesting a corporeality that no one has access to, but especially not even, you know, the experience of those that the work is sort of claiming to be about. You know, the disabled body is most alienated from works like this, because the disabled body is the least capable of adhering to these pristine notions of the body that are clean and follow the straight lines and, you know, stay within the closed system and smell good and, you know, look good. We're so tidy and neat. Yeah. So again, yes, this dynamic of like alienation, finding, you know, grasping for what you want in the most futile sort of way. Comes back again and again. But yeah, that whole tangent about the Children's Hospital, I just wanted to bring it up again because there is this like hard to sort of articulate conflict with like scale. You know, they're like little braces, childish braces. A piece coming up soon has like a Bugs Bunny decal on it. It's very like uncanny, but anyways, I know it's like, I don't know what the like common practices are with artists, but like picking favorites. But I really love this piece. I think that I worked on this piece the longest. I thought about it the most. I hadn't mentioned this yet, but most of this show, the pieces in it, were conceived from the hospital room. I had like several sort of long bouts of hospitalizations that were unexpected and ran longer than I would have wanted them to. And so I was like sketching down to the detail, planning out, you know, like sketching in my notes app on my computer, any way that I could, sort of planning out these pieces so meticulously, so that as soon as I got to my studio, I could be like, bam, 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 just like really go into like fabrication mode. And I drew this piece in all its variations so many ways. I couldn't get this concept out of my head as it ran in parallel with the other pieces that are really working, again, in sort of this like medicalized, industrial material sort of space where you're really clearly reading those materials as medical, as, you know, bodily, as, I won't use the word scientific, but there's like a medical sterility to all of them that are, you know, sort of like unifying real medical tools being incorporated, deconstructed, and reconstructed, and all of that. And I wanted to break up that materiality because I think that in this sort of like crafting of, you know, this idea of like a room full of bodies that are not bodies or that are trying to be bodies, all, you know, sort of like pathetic group of piecemeal characters all together in a room for you to look at. I really wanted to completely sort of build something from the ground up and evoke exactly what I was doing in my other works without relying on the like charged materiality of like medical materials, because that you know, using those in and of themselves like carry a very immediate connotation. You're gonna read that as you're gonna connect it to the hospital, you're gonna connect it to ability, you're gonna like, you sort of like, you know, it's helping you make those connections. And I was like, I wanted to challenge myself to make something that did that for me in a sort of really not taboo, but sort of like unexpected, I guess, material. And I really like fell in love with these old wooden crutches that I made and completely articulated using metal hardware. And yeah, I think that when I thought about the core sort of root of the show, this futile desire to be legible as a body, and all of the sort of like charged and really potent connotations that come with being denied that legibility, or being allowed that legibility, but then being asked to perform it in a very specific way. All of these things, I kept coming back to this sort of central image of a body that is so abstracted in materiality, but then still like legible anatomically, and using crutches, again, in the same way that the medical materials are functioning in a lot of ways, but as that sort of like mental gap between what it's trying to be and what it is. And you know, the evocation of the physical form of legs, like certainly you find that here, but I think that thinking about the mobility aid as its own sort of corporeal form is loops back to what I was saying earlier about this idea of this sort of triple cyborg that I think about a lot. A cyborgian future in which, you know, like this sort of anatomy is just as cyborgian and legible as, you know, Blade Runner-esque cyborg android that is conforming to the human ideals, and yet like skirting around every sort of anatomical requirement for that. And so I think that having this piece sort of grounding in the space sort of very centralized, and sort of having it be surrounded by everything else was really what I was going for. And I think that making this piece was the most cathartic and satisfying. And I don't think I've ever felt that way about a piece before. I'm usually very critical about my own work, and if not even critical, just more sort of like very pragmatic about how it functions and what I'm trying to do. And this is one of the first pieces that I've genuinely felt just so relieved to have made it, and for it to exist, and for it to sort of be this like other body that is in the space. And yeah, and the like medical tubing that you see are connected to sort of like IV like lock connectors that are used as like common practice in all sort of like medical syringes and stuff that I've fixed into the woodwork, and that is this like IV bag that I've had since 2017, actually, from a pretty intense hospitalization, and it's just another piece from the medical archive. But this idea of the body as like a circuit, I'm really interested in that, and how in a lot of the sort of like able-bodied standards and comfortable notions of the body that we have, it really relies on this closed body as a closed loop, and anything that sort of like breaks that or interrupts that flow of, whether it's like a literal interruption of flow, you know, intervention for circulation, intervention for respiration, you know, that's very sort of jarring, but also the idea that the body cannot survive on solely what exists within it is sort of a very anxiety-inducing feeling for people. And so, you know, I'm very fascinated with the body that is only able to exist because of what is externally affixed to it. This is like the crippled cyborg as something that is, you know, fundamentally supported only by, you know, the tubes that are extruding from it, the metal pieces that have been affixed to it, the prosthetics that have been replacing its internally failing organic matter, and sort of like becoming really comfortable with this idea that a body that is unsustainable when it is not, completely piecemeal. I think becoming really comfortable with that is a very important part in moving forward in how we can think about like disability theory, or how we think about the disabled body as it's like represented in the media, because it breaks away from this expectation that the disabled body is something that needs to be like fixed or cured on like a base level, but then it also like really examines this idea of like the idea of like deserving to live, which I think is not something that I really think about a lot in my work, because I don't believe really in this idea of like deserving to live or not, but I think that like coming from the Children's Hospital into like adult care, that rhetoric really disappears, where people are like, don't worry, you deserve to survive and to live. People are telling you that as a child. You don't hear that as like a sick adult. People don't go out of their way to like tell you that, and that's a really interesting sort of dichotomy. But I think that if you look at a body that is, has this, again, I'm really interested in like futility and like fragility, but it's sort of like frail thing that is so supported by all of its external hardware. I think that that's a really beautiful sort of ideal for me. I think that it's comforting, but it's also really radicalizing for me in the idea of like what beautiful corporeality can be, and also like what autonomous life can be. I think that I'll talk about this more when we get to the slide for it, but the idea of care and infantilization within that, coming back to the idea of like sexualization within vulnerability, but also the idea of the helpless thing, and how like, again, as humans, like we still have this very predatory notion of survival that is really rooted in like capitalism, of course, but like the idea that helplessness fundamentally sort of detracts from your like value, what you can contribute, how you can function, and give back to the world to make your existence sort of worth happening. So to completely separate from that and be like, what do we think about bodies that are completely unable to do anything to contribute, and that actually require an extreme amount of resources to be kept alive, and it's extremely costly, not only to them, but to everyone around them, to the infrastructures that are supporting them, and like, how do we find like true validity in that? Because in all of the rhetoric that we have right now, there's always going to be something that's going to completely invalidate the innate value of that person. Like what conversations are we going to be having around like whether or not it's like worth it to keep this person alive? And again, like everything that I say, I have to like give a caveat. Again, this is like thinking about larger sort of like radicalizing ideals around the body. This is not about people who are on like end of life care. This is not about like literal preservation of life in that sense. It's more about breaking away from an ideal that asks that a body contributes more than it consumes. And as a body, personally, that consumes a great deal to be able to survive, and now is really reliant on the help of others, the care of others, to be able to function. I think it's an important discussion that I still have personally. But I think that within a lot of disability discourse, a lot of shame around identifying as disabled or talking about invisible disability comes from the marking of the body as then something that is, needs to be watched essentially and analyzed for its value now, because how it's moving through space could be, really consuming and sort of detrimental. And I think that there's a lot of shame around that, about, demanding the care that you need and the space that you need for your body that is not able to function in the way that it's being asked to. So that's this piece. I did not expect to go on that tangent with this piece, but this one's called A Bundle of Kindling. All of the titles for these pieces are taken from my video piece that I'll show, that is in the space. It's called Not a Body. But yes, all the titles for the sculpture pieces come from that piece, Bundle of Kindling. Just a close-up shot of the sort of medical tubing, all connected, and I preserved all the sort of labels that are put on the tube. So, you know, every tube has a label that says, you know, what medication is in it and when it needs to be changed. All just sort of like, again, this idea of like archiving deterioration and illness and making precious of these objects. But yes, moving on. This piece is called a mistranslation. And this piece, this is interesting information, but this one took the longest for me to sort of figure out and to work with. And I knew I very much, well, I fell in love with this prosthesis, I'll be honest. I found this piece and I took it apart and I put it back together and you know, was looking at it, working with it, and it felt so dear and so precious. And it has this Bugs Bunny decal on the back for whatever child wore this that wanted Bugs Bunny wrapping on the calf every day. And I think that that's a really common thing that I forgot completely about when I was like, you know, making this work. A really big part of like the sort of children's hospital experience is like taking things that you are experiencing every day that are like really inherently medicalized and like making them cool and approachable by like putting stickers on them. And so if you had like a chest port, or if you had like an IV pole that you were going to be attached to for a long time, or longer than 2 weeks, you know, you get to like decorate it, and you get to like customize it, and you get to like, you know, get a Looney Tunes character put on it, whatever. So that, just like finding this prosthesis and like sort of work, like trying to like work with it as a material, brought back that sort of interesting memory again. Just like, I mean, I don't even want to know like what branding deals are going on in like behind the scenes. So like for hospitals to be like, yeah, put Mickey Mouse on your IV pump, really great. But sorry, this is like a really anti-Disney presentation. I didn't intend for that, but yeah. So mistranslation. I think that like with the last piece that I showed, again, like I just talked about this idea of the body as sort of a circuit or as a system. I'm really interested in like finding ways to represent that. And again, like really dwelling on this idea of the antiquation within illness. And you know, antiquation in multiple senses. I guess that for me, the disabled body, the sick body have always been seen and treated as sort of really antiquated objects. You know, it's like the disabled body to me is like the equivalent of the like tube TV in your grandparents' house that's like still RCA hookup, and you know, it's like a clunky thing that is difficult to navigate, and is sort of, you know, difficult to continue with the sort of like modernization of medicine and science that is very popular right now and is very easy to sort of market and sell. Because how can you sort of sell this ideal of ever-progressing science and medicine that is trendy and accessible and makes you healthier and hotter when you have very, very sick and disabled people moving through society? It's very counterintuitive to a larger narrative around existence in the body that is easier to sell, more profitable to sell. So the disabled body is sort of an antiquated thing. And then also this sort of literal antiquation of illness where there's this outer presentation of the scientific and medical world as very, very advanced scientifically, which is true in many, many ways, but in the most base and daily ways, you know, hospitals and the systems within them and the technology being used within them are extremely antiquated. And that's a combination of reasons, but you have old doctors who don't want to update the systems that they're using. You have ways that have worked for decades, and why would you change it out if it works so well? All of this, and that's not to say it's good or bad necessarily, but it's interesting because the medical sort of like pastiche, as I've experienced it, is like the hyper new and like trendy and like slick, clean medical device up against the like most janky, antiquated, like what broom closet did you pull that thing out of thing being used on you. And it's this like reality that, you know, even if we have the tools, even if the perception that we have of science and medicine is true, even if those tools exist somewhere in some lab, they are not accessible to the people that need to use them. And so the experience of most medicalized bodies is this interesting conflation between the like hyper antiquated and the like sci-fi-esque new. And it's very difficult to reconcile because it's like, why am I able to access this, but like, you know, you're like, it's like the iron lung over there in the corner, you know, it's like, it's very, very interesting, and I think it's, I mean, at a base level, it's just the way that, you know, funding and money moves within the medical system, but then, for me, it's very loaded symbolically, just in the way that we regard medical treatment and the sort of, you know, like what we need for the body, but that sort of juxtaposition, that aesthetic of like right between those two spaces is very fascinating for me. And so, I don't know if the details are coming through on this, but this piece has like Ethernet, oh God, I hate this, but like Ethernet female holes. I'm sorry. And they're connected to this very like industrial surgical tubing, rubber tubing that is still used in surgical operations, but also a very common industrial material. And you know, there's sort of like Ethernet male heads on those, and it's sort of like connecting all these different parts, and a lot of like useless connections too. I'm very fascinated with that. You know, it's like, you know, one plug plugged into another plug, and the source of the connection is unknown or seems nonsensical or is arbitrary. And I think that a lot of also, you know, what happens within, as soon as the body moves away from an experience that is legible and sort of able-bodied, you move into the space of like not knowing, being a big part of your existence. And that's not knowing what's happening with you, not knowing what's wrong with you, sure, but also this like fundamental not knowing that we have about the body. You know, we know a lot about the body, some could say, but we know, but how much this is gonna be so confusing. How much we don't know is far greater than how much we do know. Like, what the questions that we have about the body and things that we like fundamentally do not understand, and having no concept of how we even approach understanding those things far outweigh the things that we are fully assured on in terms of how the body functions. And so there is, I think, a lot of futility in illness that is lifelong, because once you sort of break away from the idealization of an existence that's based on like finding a cure for whatever ailment you have, you sort of settle into this, you know, like the long winter or whatever, you know, like the disabled experience that is like fully lived and not with any intention of sort of like augmenting that. I think that it's then settling into this idea of like, of the not knowing within corporeality, and I think that is actually something that is extremely universal. I think that like everyone exists within the like not knowing of corporeality, but you aren't forced to acknowledge that within yourself until you have to first acknowledge that like something is going on with your body that you don't understand, or that doctors don't understand, or that is like really not normative to like where you should be with your body right now, from whoever's telling you that, you know. And so I think that in a lot of my work, I'm really interested in bringing the viewer in and sort of like, again, breaking down these delineations in identity between disabled and abled, or sick and not sick, because, you know, a great deal of that stratification is for the purpose of the able-bodied individual to say, you know, I don't have to think about that, I don't have to look at that, like, the sick, the disabled, like, they're over there being sick and disabled, and I'm over here in my able body. And I think that if we were, you know, if like, I think that a lot of these discussions, you know, that I mentioned in terms of like radicalized futurity around the body, a lot of those things are really rooted in a collective acknowledgement of uncertainty and corporeality and a lack of understanding. And like, you know, it's been very interesting in the last few years also examining like body awareness culture, or this idea of like knowing your body, being in tune with your body, in whatever ways you're sort of coming to that practice. And I think that that's like a very enviable sort of idea and practice for me, but also I think it really speaks to this, again, this desire that is rooted in fear, but this desire to really have an assured understanding of the vessel that you're existing in, and like that's a fallacy, I think, fundamentally, and I think that that's a really sort of important part of being human. And yeah, I think that so that sort of like abstract, nonsensical nature of the body that cannot be discerned, refuses to be discerned, all of these things. Again, the disabled body is such a like concentrated ball of like all anxieties that humans feel all the time, no matter what their legibility is, no matter what their delineations are. So it's like you can look to the disabled body as like a really compacted amalgamation of like all the fears that we have, you know, all the anxieties that we have, all the discussions that we're too scared to have. Like it's an amazing, amazing body to examine. But I think that within that, like this idea of, you know, disabled being separate from the able body allows for the examining of the disabled body to become sort of spectacle. And I've written about and talked about a little bit, not here I guess, but the sort of idea of the disabled body as a spectacle. And, you know, this idea of disabled performance being a spectacle, and this idea that you can, like, as an able-bodied viewer, engage with the disabled body for X amount of time, then walk away from that and sort of resume a closed, able-bodied experience. And I think that that is one of the most difficult things for me to sort of tackle in my practice, because it has to do a lot with giving up control and sort of acknowledging that whatever dynamic is happening between me and the viewer, my work and the viewer, the able-bodied viewer is always going to have more control than I am, but just because of the way the hierarchy exists, like able-bodied people have more innate power, more innate privilege, and so even in a dynamic in which I'm asserting so much of my own experience, so much of my own thought, you know, an able-bodied person is able to sort of walk away from that experience still higher up in the pre-existing hierarchy than I am. And it took a long time for me to actually realize I was really misunderstanding how complex dynamics of power are in looking. And I was going at it a lot more didactically, where it's like, if I'm putting on this like pretty shocking performance and making you watch it, then I'm the one that's in control, obviously. But in truth, it's really more complicated than that, because it's like, I, the disabled body, am, you know, pushing myself and struggling and going through a lot of pain to put on this performance to make you, the able-bodied viewer, understand something that you don't. And you have the ability to, at any time, walk away and just stop looking. You can just turn away and stop looking at the work whenever you want. And like, that sucked, acknowledging that. I think that was like a big sort of like, when I realized that, I was like, oh shit, this is gonna be harder than I thought. And like, it's simultaneously like so disempowering, but also like such a like powerful representation of how we even like, of how we navigate otherness just in general, where it's like you expect that someone who's willing to engage with otherness critically, like looking at art about it, would be able to sort of like cede the control that you want them to. But it's so much far more complicated than that, because, you know, we are trained and we understand that art is something that you look at and then you walk away from. And so I think that in my work, where I'm like, I want the viewer to sort of like be uncomfortable in these ways or break down their own identity in these ways. Like, a lot of times I think that that's so much to ask, because what ends up happening is that, someone just like walks away from a piece of work, or like, doesn't, or like looks at it in a way that I didn't expect, or looks at it in a way that is, completely outside of sort of anything that I would have expected or would have thought that would happen. And at the end of the day, it's like, I am the disabled body creating a spectacle for the able-bodied viewer. And I am in many ways within that, creation of spectacle, performing a disabled ideal that is expected of, the disabled body, which is like, you're going to explain yourself to me, and you're going to elucidate your experience for me in a way that I understand. I'm gonna look at it however I want to, and then I'm gonna sort of be done with that. And that's the dynamic that exists everywhere, all the time, between able-bodied people and disabled bodies. Not just in the art viewing space. When you see a disabled body on the other side of the crosswalk, when you see someone in the supermarket that you read as disabled, when you encounter someone that you are unsure of how to read and how to label, and what their legibility is, and how disabled are they? What kind of disabled person are you? What is your disability? How do I, sorry, I'm role-playing as an able-bodied person right now. How do I interact with your disability? How do I interact with your otherness? And you want those answers, and we're expected to be given those answers so readily. And me, also, I am not inside of every aspect of disability. I am not a part of the deaf community in the way that it exists, as sort of a sub-community that is largely unseen, largely unheard, has a language that is largely untaught and definitely is not standardized. It is extremely stratified. And so I think that in examining how I'm making work and thinking about this idea of creating a spectacle, creating a disabled spectacle, I really sort of come to terms with what my relationship to the viewer is, and this sort of ongoing conversation about how much is too much to give, or where are the lines of control that you can draw as a subject that is offering themselves up to be dissected. And it is a harsh slap to be on sometimes. I think that the able-bodied gaze is unrelenting, and it is always, as this idea of the disabled performer and the disabled spectacle. Like I said, it's a performance that never ends. You can step up on the stage, whether it's in the creation of this kind of work or when I make work that is featuring my body. You can step up on that stage and sort of play with that idea of autonomy in a great deal of ways, but when you step off of that stage, you're not suddenly relegated back to the private sphere, with what happens with an able-bodied performer. When they step off of the stage, they go back to being an individual person that is not to be dissected, whereas a disabled body is not given the privilege of privacy anytime. You are expected to be completely upfront about how you're dying, why you're dying, what it feels like, and what other people should think about it. You're expected to provide all the information that able-bodied people will need in order to interface with you in the most comfortable way for them. And so the performance never ends. And I think that, realizing that, as I was thinking and writing and making this work specifically, realizing it again in a more intense way, I got really excited actually, because I was sort of creating these surrogate performers and creating these disabled bodies that are performing for you or performing for me in this space unwittingly, really tapping into that dynamic where it's I'm going to create these fading, futile bodies in these sort of really piecemeal constructions, and I'm going to set them up for people to come and look at every day. And I'm going to make a spectacle of their inability to adhere to the able-bodied standard. And it is, in its essence, a concentrated look at the ever encoring, always happening disabled performance for the able-bodied viewer in a way that is, quite harrowing, thinking about these as bodies and like what rights then they are wielded by you, that they have no control, that they are relegated to this white box, and we're gonna sit here and dissect them and look at pieces of them and talk about them and whatever, and they have no autonomy over that. So even in the sort of title of the work and the video piece that I made, thinking about like the power in saying this is a body, this isn't a body, and then first of all, like what then does this become if it is a body, and like what are the like ethics then of this? And then even within that, it's like, okay, this is a body, but it is a like damaged, broken, weak, unable body, and so even if it is a body, it's okay what we're doing to it. Engaging all these thoughts and bringing into the viewers all of this as well, hopefully. So really thinking about the body as a system, the body as a performer, all of that. So this piece is on the wall, and it's called A Pound of Flesh. I actually prototyped this piece when I was doing a residency at Human Resources, and I really wanted to play with like illusions of weight, illusions of, pressure, all of these things, like confusing sort of anatomy, but again here, like this is the like white silicone foot. I should have mentioned in this piece, this like one of the like Ethernet cords, I think it's hard to see, but it like connects into a like Ethernet port on this little foot under the chair. So again, another silicone foot, but so this is a crutch foot that is hanging from this like industrial meat hook. And I think that this piece, more than any of the other pieces, is just sort of about the like hyper objectification of the disabled body and also how abject it becomes. And I think that there's something when I'm thinking about the disabled body under a gaze, there's something about like consumption and this sort of way that a body is like visually consumed, that it is like dissected and then sort of like eaten piece by piece as it is examined. I think that that's something that like thematically I always sort of think about when I talk about the body in parts and the disabled body as a subject. But I think that it was very interesting for me to think about, also this replacing of anatomy, this sort of cyborgian, again, this idea of the replacement of the organic anatomy with the inorganic, and what that looks like when you're working with these like didactic medical forms. The mobility aid as like cyborgian material is very like foreign. Like I sort of find that very exciting visually, and I think that again this sort of stigma, or no, let's not talk about stigma. This sort of like codification of disability, and the ways in which we rely on these very specific sort of group of visual indicators of disability. Wheelchair, crutches, you see it, you see the object, and you understand, got it. This person is working with a different level of ability. They are not fully able-bodied, got it, understand. These are the sort of symbols that we expect all disabled bodies to present or to have with them at all times to signal to people, that they should be interfaced with as someone that is, not able-bodied. And it's a very small range of sort of very comfortable signifiers, the oxygen, whatever, and it comes, of course, from media representations of illness and disability, and what we're comfortable seeing in those media representations is what we come to expect from disabled bodies that we interface with. And this is very, on a surface level, it's very frustrating, but also, this is the question, again, of this idea of, like, performing disability, where it's like, you have to be sort of going through these very specific emotions within your own body and within its own deterioration, to even be sort of validated in its deterioration, to even be, it's like you're asking to be seen as valid within the ways in which your body is unable to adhere to the expectations provided to, or put upon it. But at the same time, you're being asked to sort of like deteriorate in a very hyper-specific way that's like almost impossible to do, and to do that, you know, gracefully in a way that is undisruptive, which is certainly impossible to do. But yeah, so I think that using the crutch and using the shower chair, using the mobility aid in my work, I come back to that a lot because I think that there is a great deal of expectation in this sort of disabled performance to really use this like very small vocabulary to articulate yourself legibly. But yeah, so this next piece, this is the last sculptural piece, and it's called A Shallow Grave. And on the top of the tray, there's this sort of foot with all these like IV connections coming out of it, and it's in this little like lockbox that's used to store floppy disks. And then this is like a medical tray that I sort of assembled, and again, this fourth piece is down here. And I think that this, you know, sort of in relation to a bundle of kindling and also a mistranslation, again, like looking at the tubing and the idea of the like arbitrary nonsensical system, and you know, like really reveling with the nonsense of the body, and the ways in which, again, like the body is such a like fundamentally precarious fabrication in every iteration that it exists in. Even in the sort of most able-bodied, even in a body that is adhering to the able-bodied standing of existence in sort of like most literal way, everything about that construction is so fragile and collapses so instantly under any sort of pressure. And so I think, I don't know if it's been clear through the show, but I was very, very interested in creating these like very, very nonsensical bodies that are sort of very precarious looking as well. And yeah, so this like orthesis on wheels that are sort of like precariously set in the gallery. Very impractical, very ridiculous, like most bodies. So yeah, yes, I shall. Oh, I guess I'll talk about the foot now. So, I was thinking a lot about how, like, when the anatomical body did appear in the work, how it would appear, how it would function, what it would be, how it would do that, all of that. And I did not want to use like a piece of I wanted to use a piece of myself, but I didn't want that to be literal, and I didn't want to be like an actual self-assertion to the work. So these are silicone casts of feet, my feet, and they are white, which several people asked me about, and I wasn't actually expecting people to ask me about that, but I appreciated it, and I think that that really comes back to this idea of like alienating myself from the work and alienating my ability to sort of find myself in the work, and I think that, you know, this idea that like even in representing anatomy within the work, it is an anatomy that is idealized, and it is an anatomy that is inaccessible to the artists themselves. And I think that being othered from my own work is great. I love it. I think that it's very grounding, and it's very rooted in sort of like real translation of experience for me, and you know, this sort of, I don't know, I feel like I like to sort of like, I think a lot of my work is very funny. I laugh about it. I know other people don't think it's very funny, and that's okay. But to me, it's like hilarious that I work so hard on all this work, and I put so much of myself into it, but I absolutely refuse to let myself be legible in any of it, and in fact, it is so alienating to me, and so inaccessible to me, and so non-representational to me of any sort of experience that would, you know, in sort of visual terms would seem accessible to me, and that is great. I really like that.
I'm very happy with that. So I think that, whiteness in intersectionality is really valuable to talk about, because intersectionality is, like looking at the disabled experience as it intersects with the experience of being of color, with the experience of being queer. I think that disability and queerness are fundamentally inseparable. The disabled body is a queer body. I will say that with my full chest all the time. But people really struggle, and I think that within digesting otherness, there's such a difficulty within disability to contend with complex intersectionality of the disabled body that is also of color is one of the most difficult things that I've had to confront working with different institutions, talking about my work. And there's this story that I sort of always tell, which is I was on a panel for something that I can't remember now, and I was asked if I had to design my ideal, perfectly accessible space, what would that look like? And I was too stunned to speak. I did not have an answer right away. And I was really trying to figure out how to say, that's a ridiculous question, without saying that outright. Because the answer is, in the sort of bleakest, realist of terms, that there is no way now to design spaces that are perfectly accessible. We've really progressed past that in sort of where we exist and how we understand space and how we understand design. But also, I knew that they were asking me about disability, accessibility. But really, it's confounding because it's let's play the hypothetical game, so fun. If I do design a space that is perfectly accessible, whatever the hell that means, for everybody, every disabled body out there, I'm still going to be so alienated moving through that space as a person of color and as a queer person. So, we now have come to think about problem solving in otherness in this way where it's okay, let's brainstorm. If we could create a utopia, what would that look like? And then what steps can we take to reach that utopia? That's sort of the really base way that we've started thinking about problem solving around otherness. And a disabled body cannot exist in a utopia. In the way that we now understand utopia, and we have created utopia, the utopian ideal of society, either everyone's disabled or no one's disabled in a utopia. So I don't really know actually how to reconcile that kind of thinking, because we have designed modalities of thinking in which it's really difficult to approach intersectionality in a way that is, really radical in terms of making progress and making space and accommodation and changing modes of thinking. Because even in the modes of thinking that, people that are trying to be the most forward thinking and the most radical in their accessibility, they are unable to sort of think at the same time about inaccessibility as a product of any other form of otherness. And that is no fault of anyone, but it is rather a fault of a larger societal conditioning that we have to think about the way in which we compartmentalize people and their experiences. So, that accessibility anecdote that I always tell isn't very fun or very exciting, but I think that it is just always a good point for me to make about how we think about things and how, even in my own practice, I have no sort of idealized hopes for the kind of thought or change in those very buzzwordy kind of ways that this could produce, but rather, that change, especially around the disabled experience, is actually really predicated upon founding larger and more encompassing languages around empathy and emotional intelligence, because it's an otherness that really requires an ability to look at an experience and not really need to understand it literally through concrete examples of otherness to be able to relate to it or to be able to understand how that otherness functions very differently from otherness within, existing as a body of color, where there's such well-documented, systematically reinforced forms of oppression and violence that you can look back to historically and sort of use as irrefutable evidence against change that needs to be made. Whereas the documentation for the ways and nuanced and very diverse ways in which the disabled body has experienced violence since the dawn of time. It's a very complicated way of thinking that is very different from how we now sort of expect to think about otherness in most progressive spaces. So, yeah, I don't really have a solution for that. I just like to point it out, but yeah. So I just want to move through these next few pieces quickly because I want to open up for discussion and hear what everyone has to say, I hope. But on the wall, there's 3 pieces, and these are coming, just in very visual sort of encapsulations of this sort of like crippled cyborg theory, where the crippled cyborg is, thinking about like external anatomy that is so counterintuitive to what we think about cyborg futurity as sort of like automation of the body, but rather like a completely manual operation of the body that is taken away from the internal organic functioning and outsourced to this sort of like clunky materiality on the outside. And this is a triptych of diagrams that I made looking at like lots and lots of patent documents for real prostheses. Yeah, again, bringing these are like very delicate, these are prints done on vellum and they're sort of like bolted into the wall. And I think just, really thinking about sort of the materiality itself, sort of balance between the delicate and the industrial, sort of, again, sort of like what measures are being taken for the body and like where is the effort being placed and like what are the true steps that are being taken for the body. It's like there's a lot of externalized alteration and effort that can be made for the body, and it's like, the heavy bolts and the delicate vellum, but truly, what is the body getting out of that, or like what is really happening to the body internally, I guess. But yeah, so it's a triptych on the wall. And then the very last thing is this video, which I'm not going to play the whole thing. I just want to show sort of where the titles are coming from. It's a long, I think it's 7 minutes, but it's this long performance that I did, performance, whatever you call that, but writing this sort of long form poem, sort of written piece, and transcribing that onto these medical bracelets. This is not a body, it's a long, tiresome affair, a bad taste in the back of the mouth. This is not a body, it's a losing pattern, an implanted memory, a slap in the face. And so the video goes on, and I think there's about 378, 79 bracelets in the whole thing. And it is interspersed with sort of hand-drawn illustration. And this was at the end of the video, but this was actually the first piece that I finished completely. And with the sound composition for and everything. And it really served as an anchor for the whole show. And I think that so much of the ideas that became really, really well developed in the show started off as just like what I wanted to explore in making this piece. And so it's my first video piece that I've made that I'm not in. And that felt great and made it a lot easier to edit, I'll be honest. But I also think that sort of in the context of my practice, it's very important for me because, again, it's the almost like denying of self-representation, making a video about what a body is or isn't, and like refusing to include myself in that. And I think for my own survival and also within my practice, just theoretically, I guess, I'm really fascinated with this idea of like denying myself the like legibility of being a body. And I know that's like, obviously, you look at me and it's not like you're like, what is that? Sitting in a chair up there, you know, it's not, you're not confused, but I think that in like moving away from the comfort of being like, yes, I am a body, and I am awarded everything that a body is awarded, and I'm going to be forever, you know, pulling away from that and saying like, maybe I'm not, and if I am, like maybe I need to completely redefine that for myself. That's really what's at the base, I think, of this work that's to come and this work that I've made here. But yeah, I just want to say, actually, this is some new work that I have coming up. And I am making work with myself in it, but really delving into fetish, disability fetishism, and the politics of care. I talked about a little bit, health and deterioration, and really looking at infantilization of disability existence, and how the unsexing, the castration of the disabled body is so linked to this perception of inability. And disabled bodies, as I like to say, is both hyper-castrated and hypersexualized. It is stripped completely of its autonomy to move through space as a sexual being that is making its own decisions, but it is completely open and available to become a sexual vessel for the fantasies of those around it. And I'm frankly quite obsessed with disability fetishism, and oh my God, I can't. There's no time to even go down this rabbit hole of disability porn and research that I've been doing, but I'm very, very, very fascinated with this idea of the disabled body as like tool for able-bodied fetish, and these fetishes that exist around wanting to be disabled, wanting to use ortheses, the aestheticization of the orthesis, which I am fully guilty of myself. So it's so uncanny to see this like Tumblr era gif, you know, this like girl in high heel boo with the, you know, ortheses, like ridiculous. And sort of these like, what is it within the dynamics that exist between the able body and the disabled body that allow for these fetishes to grow and exist so rampantly that, you know, there are able-bodied people that are amputating themselves. I'm in like an amputation Facebook group. Again, no time, I'm so sorry, but we can talk about it one-on-one. But people are amputating their own limbs to achieve a disabled existence that is like fetish fulfillment for them. Amazing. So fascinating. I love that. That is so fascinating to me. And so, again, it's about all of these complex dynamics about existence. Like, I can't even, the complexities around care and around attention about within vulnerability specifically, and how that within itself is a big part of a fetish, where you want to be cared for and you want to go to extreme lengths to make yourself unable to do things for yourself so that someone else can care for you, and not being a source of you know, literal sexual pleasure for people, is amazing to me, and says so much about how we relate to inability and our own anxieties around futility and helplessness. I think it's really beautiful. But I wanted to show these to you because I've been looking at them for a long time, and it's insanely fascinating to me. And this is sort of like the next breadth of work that I'm going into that I wanted to share a little bit. Yeah, I'd love some questions, please, or anything. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, hi. First of all, thank you so much. I found your work a year and a half ago and working on my own very first self-portrait centering my disability, and you're not to say the dreaded word inspiration, but your work is absolutely fantastic and means so much to me as a chronically ill person. So thank you. But my question is, kind of melding my perspective of what you were talking about with the able-bodied gaze and the kind of morbid curiosity that we feel we must fulfill, and purposefully making a spectacle out of disability to kind of fulfill that and also subvert that expectation. I'm wondering if you specifically feel an obligation or any sort of motivation to make work like that because you specifically have a very specialized illness? Because I know I have Marfan syndrome, which is like a very rare chronic illness, and I am physically a very textbook example of it. So whenever someone asks me, the plaintiff, oh, well, what's wrong with you? I feel obligated to let them know everything because it is, you know, awareness that could save someone from death. That is something, you know, that you mentioned people are very afraid of. So I'm wondering if that rarity takes place in any of your.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would say no as the like simple initial answer, because what my illness is, unless you like read the bio on my website, I think, is like very elusive. Like it's like, what's wrong with her? What's going on? She says she's sick. Like, what's happening? You know, it's like I get, you know, I had people, a lot of people, you know, when I'd be showing work, being like, so what is it? So what's going, like, what's wrong? Like, what is wrong? Like, you know, tell me. And I think that was like jarring for me, first of all. And I do find myself, you know, I'm very open. Like, I'm very willing to share. Like, I'll talk about everything, anything. Like, I'll tell you all this information. And I also, but in my work, I think that I was for a time making work that included, you know, personal writing or like sort of medical records and information where it was like you could sort of like piece together, you could like follow the clues and like figure out the diagnosis and like whatever, go home and look it up yourself, whatever. But I think now it's really, I really enjoy playing with this sort of like vagueness, like it's like the vague suggestion of inability. What is its source? We don't know. It's like this vague suggestion of illness, like where is it coming from? Like you're not gonna know. And I think that denying that, those answers is really important for me personally, just on like a survival level. But also I think that, you know, when I talk about my work, like you said, people sort of expect, because I'm so sort of vulnerable in many ways and forthcoming, I think, in my work, that I'll also act as a sort of like end-all be-all mouth for whatever illness I have and every other disability ever. And I think that I'm always very quick to sort of say, you know, like you should really understand the relationship between disabled artists and the work that they're making. It's not an invitation to sort of delve into their personal life and get all the answers that you feel like you weren't given in the work. And that's what I'm talking about when I say that, you know, the viewer sort of expects you to lay everything out, lay everything there for them. And even if people can't articulate it explicitly, there is that sort of like, well, where's the rest of it? Like, where's the explanation? Where's the plaque on the wall where I can read about what this artist is really talking about, you know? And that's, like I said, and like you said, is a part of that sort of, that expectation for performing legibility. And so, not with that intention, like I'm not going to tell you what my illness is and all that just because I don't want to make it easy for you. That's not how I'm thinking about it, but it is very much like, I think that, like, you know, playing with that sort of like vague suggestion or the sort of like evocation of disability, evocation of illness that has no source that the viewer can trace is much more like exciting and fascinating for me because it elicits a discomfort, but also because it, like, you know, it asserts that you are not going to be given the answers that you want, and in fact you shouldn't expect them. But yeah.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
My question is related. I'm running out of like brain juice for the night, so it might not be super articulate, but also thinking about the gaze and as also a disabled artist, like what happens then, and this is just something that I think about a lot and may not even have an answer, but what happens when all the non-disabled people get too uncomfortable and leave the room and we're the only ones left? Like, just like, my question is basically like the non-disabled gaze, question mark?
Sure, yes, no, very important. And I think that a lot of disabled artists and a lot of people like working within disability theory specifically are like 100% in this crowd space of like, I'm making work for the other disabled people out there to look at and to understand, and it's like, it doesn't need to be accessible to the able-bodied people, and in fact, for many people beyond that, it's not going to be. It's going to be quite alienating. And I think that I feel very sort of like, it's very like safe and very comfortable for me being around other people who obviously, who sort of like understand from whatever direction they're coming from the work. And it's something that it's like a gift that I did not expect to receive when I started making work, to sort of like find community through that, or to just, you know, have that moment of like relating to someone so deeply on such disparate experience that is grounded fundamentally in like very specific forms of otherness, very specific forms of pain, very specific forms of erasure. Like that is something that is like invaluable to me and is for many people a great source of survival. And so I think that like the disabled on disabled gaze has like been going strong for a long time, because for so long it was the only way that the disabled body was truly seen in a way that wasn't contorting, was when it was under a fellow disabled gaze. And so, you know, like queer theory is now sort of like rising to the scholarly surface, where it's like, oh, like, let's have a disability theories program, or a disability theories class at USC. Like, okay, it's becoming something people want to talk about. But people, you know, disabled people have been theorizing about their experience and sharing that with members of their own community for so long. And it's so undocumented, so unarchived, it's so lost to the times. And so I think that, like, in like my own, like, just like life and research and practice, like that is very comforting and precious and important to me. And like fostering conversations that are just between disabled people and like, you know, bringing in viewers to sort of witness that is very important too. But I think that in my like artwork and practice, like that moment where like all the able-bodied people leave the room has been like a very important one to me, because I've like literally had that happen, where it's like I'm doing a performance and it's like so over the top and insane that everyone's like, I'm out, like I'm actually gonna like leave and close the door, and I'm in there like alone, like, all right, well, guess I'll just sit here now, you know. And so it's like, it's that very interesting thing where as a disabled body and making work that I understand and present to an able-bodied viewer, that when that able-bodied viewer walks away, like the work to me only increases in value. And to myself, like I think that there's something incredibly important in something that is incredibly hard to look at. And I've always felt that way, and I think that in my work now, I'm just navigating like how to actually translate that into viewing experience. Because it's like, I like alienation as a material. It's very important to me, it always has been. But I think that there are also ways of talking about alienation that are not so hyper-specific, but they become inaccessible, because I also think that alienation is, again, like I said, very universalizing, and I think that like being able to find pieces of disabled experience within yourself as an able-bodied viewer is like really important to me. Like it's like really important to be like, you're a little sick too, ha ha ha, you know, or whatever. And so I think that that's always a line that I'm like figuring out, is like, where does it become too alienating, and why is it too alienating, and like, is that a valuable thing? Is that something to pull back on? Is that something to push forward on? Like, you know, so I don't have an answer to that. Like, what happens? I think what happens in reality is I kind of like look around the room, and you know, it's just, you know, cripples in the room, and you're kind of like, all right, here we are. But in reality, it's sort of like, okay, how do I, moving forward, play with this alienation as a material that is productive, I guess, you know, because I think that alienation has always been a barrier to otherness, where it's like, I just don't get it. I can't look at it. Like, I don't have to think about it. I can leave the room. Finding that space where it's like, oh shit, like, I understand this, like, I understand even a modicum of this, like, humans are selfish. We are only interested in things that pertain to ourselves. So someone is only going to stay in a lot, you know, in the simplest way of thinking about it, the most cynical way of thinking about it is like, someone's only going to stay if they're like, oh, this has something to do with me, doesn't it? kind of get it, you know, and I think that selfishness is not, there's no way to get around that in sort of this very simple way. It's something that you have to use, weaponize, and so, yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else?
I'm curious because the disabled experience we're talking about it being very otherized, but on top of that, your condition is so rare. Have you had the opportunity or much opportunity to interact with other people who share your condition?
I have never met someone that has my exact condition, which is the combination of sickle cell and thalassemia. It's rare just because of the sort of like miscegenation that needs to happen for it to occur. My dad's from Iran, where thalassemia is a Middle Eastern born and bred disease, and sickle cell, of course, developed in Africa as a resistance to malaria. My mother's from Jamaica. But when I was younger, I used to go to a summer camp that was for like sick kids. It was run by the hospital. And so every 2 weeks, like a different department of the hospital would have their sick kids at the camp, and all the counselors were nurses and doctors in training. So it was like the most surreal, sort of amazing experience for me, because I was surrounded by people who understood exactly, in often very different terms, but exactly what it meant to not be able to experience this specific idealized childhood experience in any other context than like everyone around you being extremely medically trained, there being a little hospital in the middle of the forest in case someone, you know, inevitably had a medical emergency. But it was basically like a normal kids camp, except there's like ventilators everywhere. And that was the first time that I was like really surrounded by, that was the first time I like met another kid with sickle cell. Before that, I'd never met another kid with sickle cell. Just in like people with other blood disorders or different forms of blood cancers. And that was very interesting because our experiences were very, very, very different. And so, yeah, and I think that was a very blissful and idealized time in terms of being able to meet other people that were experiencing the same thing I was, especially as a child. It was very important, very affirming, I think. And also I like, sorry, this is just a tangent, but it's like I've never been able to like do like physical activities or like be a kid and that like really classic sort of like tumbling through the grass and playing dodgeball. I don't know what kids do, but whatever, like running around and being rambunctious and like having the energy and lung capacity to do that. So it was crazy because it was like, okay, here are like 2 nurses whose whole job is to make sure that you can like kayak across the river and like fulfill that childhood dream of yours. And it was amazing. And that's like, again, one of the very specific magics of the children's hospital system. This was run by like one of the biggest children's hospitals in the US at the time. And it was like funded by whatever brand makes peanut butter Uncrustables. And that was all we ate, was Uncrustables all the time, because it was like the sponsor of this like sick kids camp. Which is just like, it's hilarious. You're like feeding cancer kids Uncrustables for lunch, like the irony is insane. But but yeah, so that was a very interesting sort of like experience in the children's hospital. And like now, like, you know, I'm the only patient with like let alone sickle cell, let alone that my doctor is treating, let alone this like rare combination of sickle cell and thalassemia. I go and meet new medical professionals and like nurses will be like, what is thalassemia? Well, you have what? And they won't even know what I'm talking about. Or I'll say that I have sickle cell and a nurse will be like, oh yeah, like I remember studying that like in med school, like when we did like blood disorders, and I'll be like, yeah. Okay, you know, glad to be, you know, popping your sickle cell cherry or whatever, but it's insane when you're like in an ER trying to get like narcotics and the person treating you has never met someone that has your condition. Yeah, so it's I wouldn't, at this point I'm very used to it, because it's always been, having a rare condition, it's always like, oh, okay, damn, like it's always that reaction from doctors where it's like, all right, gotta like break out the books for this one kind of thing. So I'm used to it, but I think it's also, there's a lot of community in the disability communities like built around shared illnesses and like hyper-specific relatability between illnesses, and I definitely don't have that. And I think that also with the condition that I have, it's so, in the way that it causes auxiliary illnesses and deteriorations, it's so hyper-specific that it's gotten to a point that it's like, the points that I find relation on are like wheelchair users or people who are just in the hospital all the time. Like that in and of itself is like something that people really relate to. Being a patient, being a queer person as a patient, like those are really strong foundations for communities. So,
Anybody else? Did you see a hand up yet?
I just want to say that I appreciate the comedy aspect of the work, because I don't know, I just wanted to say that.
thank you. I appreciate that. Yes, I like when people laugh. You can laugh.
I love to laugh, and I love something so serious, like being given like that. I think comedy is like a gesture of love. Also.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I like that.
But yeah, the meat hug,
Yes.
the buddy,
It's
like,
funny. I'm like,
Yeah.
ha ha ha, guys. Come on, the body's ridiculous and stupid. You can laugh.
and I'm excited about the new.
Yeah, thank you. Me too. Yeah, I know. I'm like, how do I make disability porn? That's what I'm thinking about right now. So, yeah, but I have this huge painting that I've made that it's like one of my favorite things that I've ever made. It's like a big painting and it's like a horse, like an anatomical structure of a horse, and there's like a little like human being like curled up in front of it and like on all fours, also like an anatomical structure. And it's like taken from this textbook I had as a kid that was like comparing the like anatomy structures between humans and horses. So it was like, here's a man on all fours and here's a horse and here are the like same bones. But and then on the painting I've written like ketamine is for horses, and I think that's like so funny. Like I hung it outside my studio, and I made that after I was like given ketamine for the first time in the hospital. I like went down like a medical K-hole. Like I'm not kidding you. I went down like a 3-day K-hole in the ICU at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. I was tripping so hard. I had like night terrors. I was like, please take me off of ketamine. It's too much. And they took me off of it and I had like night terrors, ketamine night terrors. Like hilarious. Like oh my god, medically induced K-hole. It's happened like 3 times since then. And like I just think it's so funny that they're like giving me horse tranquilizer because they're like, we don't even know what to do with you. You won't stop screaming. Please just take some horse tranquilizer and go to sleep. And I'm like, the nurses are turning into robots. This is crazy. It's hilarious to me because it's like, it's so, they're like, again, like comedy's love. And I think that like, it's all very serious. Like it's like, you're sick and you're dying and you have this disease and you're in the hospital. It's very serious. You're in a lot of pain. And it's like, this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever experienced in my life. And people are so confused and just flailing and have absolutely no idea what they're doing. And it's, like I'm really able to like laugh at that and really see just how completely ridiculous all of our ideals around safety and the body and like being cared for are. Like it's very funny to me. I think that it's very funny. And so I showed that painting to people and like curious and stuff, and they're like, what is this? Like they do not like it, so it's just up in my studio. And a lot of people are also like, people think it's like an anti opioid or anti-drug PSA or something. It's not, it's just a joke, but yeah, so thank you. I think that it is very fun. It is very funny, and I think that when I use like a prosthesis with a Bugs Bunny on it, or I like hang a freaking foot with a crutch on it from a wall with a knee hook, I'm laughing. Like, I'm laughing, and I think it's great when other people laugh too. And I understand that with things like this, you look to the other body that's making the word for permission to laugh, and that's good. Because sometimes people are making quite serious work that could be funny when you look at it, and people don't want you to laugh. And in my case, I think it's just fine to have a good chuckle.
You're also bringing people in. Like,
Yeah.
You're giving them access to the piece
Yeah.
by that gesture.
Thank you. Yeah, appreciate that. So have a good laugh if you want.
I guess I can just. I did want to mention too. So I'm visually impaired. So I actually hate going to art galleries because a lot of them have rules about how far you have to stand from exhibits. So I just can't enjoy the art. And something that I really enjoyed about your show at Hunter Show, I saw it last weekend, is I was crawling on the floor looking at the demolition side piece. I had my face this far away from the little TV trying to see everything. So it was interesting to see that that lack of legibility was kind of intentional, but also you allowed people space to really get up as close as they needed to. I almost, there's the syringe coming down from that last piece with the lockbox. I almost tripped over it because I was so looking at the details. So I think it's really interesting that a lot of art, just in general, in the art world, is inaccessible to disabled people because of how we feel about protecting, art pieces. But with your exhibit, I was able to be a weird disabled gremlin, looking around the floor at all of the pieces. So that was really cool.
I'm so glad to hear that. Yes. I mean, I think that I am always I want people to get as close as possible and to definitely do the little gremlin thing. And actually, I always have a casualty with my sculptural works. And on opening night, we had this ridiculous incident where a woman stepped on the syringe that you almost tripped on. She just stepped on it with her high heel and shattered it. And which it's fine, it's just a syringe, but it is so interesting because it's you are coming into the space as a disabled body, and you're also sort of navigating with such care. It's it's interesting, and it's what then is the interaction between an able-bodied person that does not expect there to be anything in their way as they move through the space filled with disabled bodies, and then they step on a syringe. It's oh my God, so that's happening. But yeah, so I always I think it's so fascinating watching the way people interact with the work itself too. So I wish I'd be able to see that. But yeah, I think that also how close people feel they can get. It's people feel they need to stand 6 feet away and squint at the little TV to try to see what's going on. So it's what happens when you break that barrier with the body and get up close to it and take a look. So yeah.
And on that note, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out tonight, and if I could get a round of applause for Panteha.